Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor David Geary. Hello, David. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing?
I'm great. It's a pleasure to speak to you, David. So, David,
Yeah.
we're going to hit the ground running. Why are women underrepresented in STEM? Is it a consequence of sexism?
No, I don't think it's a consequence of sexism, at least in many nations. STEM, by the way, for viewers, is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. If we look at STEM broadly, including the life sciences, there's just as many women as men. But we see differences when we move to inorganic fields, engineering, computer science, physics, those fields. And there you have underrepresentation of men, of women, 20 to 30% or so. We find that there are actually fewer women go into these fields in countries where women are have many economic, political rights and so forth, and can make free choices in their occupations. And so I don't think it's related to sexism in any way.
David, you are a leading researcher in this field. Please explain to us the concept of relative advantage. So, for example, if girls have a stronger competence in reading, are they more likely to study subjects in the humanities?
Yeah, so there have been a number of studies suggesting that people will go into fields that hit their strengths. So whether they're men or women, if they're better at language-related skills, reading comprehension, writing, so forth, then they're more likely in college, for example, and in their occupation to go into humanities-based fields. If they're relatively better in mathematics, spatial abilities, then these individuals are more likely to go into the physical sciences.
David, I've been reading for a long time that women are more likely to major in biology and the life sciences. Why is this so?
Yeah, good question. So if we look at the broader STEM fields, as I said, there's actually no sex difference. And that's because more women than men go into the life sciences. And in fact, women who have strong math, spatial ability profiles that would often lead them to physics, computer science.
Okay.
Good.
David?
Yes.
David?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. For a minute, you were breaking up, and you said that women are more likely to study the life sciences and biology. So please continue from that part. You were breaking up for a minute.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know what happened there.
Yeah, so you're clear now, so just continue.
Okay, so women who are science or life sciences, biology, who are science oriented, who are more likely than women to go into the inorganic fields, computer science, engineering, for example. That's related in part to interest differences. Women are more interested in people. So being a physician is more, involves more direct helping of people, more direct engagement of people, and probably more interested in living things more generally, which would be the interest in biology. Guys are less interested in that. They're more interested in how things work.
And why do men espouse mechanical interests?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that's been debated for quite some time. There are sex differences in mechanical reasoning abilities, your understanding of how things can be put together, how objects can be used as tools, and so forth. I've argued in the past, and in fact, in my most recent edition of Male Female, that is probably due to an evolutionary history of men engaging in more tool making than women. So if we look at who constructs tools, weapons, other sorts of tools in traditional contexts, more than 90% of the time it's men. And so there's been kind of a direct advantage to men during our evolutionary history for engaging with tools that's not there with women.
And why do women have a greater preference to form families?
Yeah, well, that's a general, that is true across all mammals, where we have heavy investment of dads in only about 5% of the species, and short-term investment in another 5% of the species. But for the vast majority of species, the females do all of the history.
David, you broke up a minute ago. You said that the females do all of the work in the vast majority of societies, and then you broke up a bit.
Okay, right. Yeah, so the women do caretaking, the majority of caretaking in every society in which it's been studied. And females do the majority of caretaking, often 100% of it, in the vast majority of mammals. And in fact, male investment in offspring is pretty uncommon in mammals and occurs in only like less than 10% of primates, for example, or maybe a bit more, but not the majority of primates. So the sex difference we see in people is just something we see across the many mammalian species.
And David, please explain to our readers why in gender egalitarian societies, women are more likely to be employed in stereotypically female jobs. Yeah, this has been a consistent finding.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the wealthier, more liberal, more egalitarian the society becomes, the more segregated and stereotypical people's occupational choices. So in very liberal Nordic countries, Sweden, for example, we have many more women in teaching and nursing and many more men in mechanical fields than you see in other countries, actually. I think that's because these countries tend to be very wealthy. They have legal and cultural systems that allows for the individual expression of people's preferences. And they have safety nets, social safety nets, so you don't have to worry as much about how much income you're going to get from this particular job. And under those conditions,
no, you may continue.
Yes.
You may continue. I was going to make a point, but you may continue.
Oh, okay, yeah. Under those conditions, people can are better able to express their underlying interests. And I think there's a sex difference in interests in some occupations versus others, and it's just more fully expressed in these contexts.
David, in one of your articles, you gave a brilliant example of Finland. In Finland, because girls have stronger reading advantages, even though they're relatively adept as scientists, they prefer to study subjects in the humanities. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that was in one of your bullet pieces, and I just said I have to share this with our readers, because often we believe that if public policy reflects new norms, then we're going to see a realignment of interest, but this is not the case. So for example, explain to us why even when parents encourage their sons to be feminists, they still play with stereotypically male toys like trucks.
Right. So the sex differences in toy preferences, for example, as you mentioned, is very large. Girls and boys in the suite of play activities is a huge difference. It's influenced by prenatal exposure to sex hormones, and there is a postnatal surge in testosterone in boys between in the first 6 months of life, and that also influences their play preferences. So the parents are not having strong influences on them because is having an even strong influence on what boys find attractive versus what girls find attractive.
Okay, you said biology. Biology had a stronger influence on what girls find attractive versus what boys find attractive. I was able to hear, but apparently there was an internet connection, so I'm just repeating it for our audience. And David, okay, all right. And David, you also specialize in status differences and occupational differences.
Right,
What?
right.
But before we ponder this discussion, I'm going to ask a question. Why are men more agentic than women? David?
Yeah,
Yeah, why are men more agentic than women?
yeah. Good question. So in social psychology, there's concepts of being agentic versus communal. Agentic means that you're kind of acting on the environment, you're ambitious, engaging in whatever is important in your culture to achieve success. Communal is more about forming relationships and focused on relationships. So there are those dimensions of life that are there for both men and women. Men are more agentic and women are more communal. Not surprisingly, found many times. And there's lots of social cultural explanations for them, but I think there's a very clear biological explanation as well. The communal aspect results is related to what we described earlier in terms of women's greater investment in families, in kids, and developing social relationships that are support systems that help them raise their kids. The agentic component of it is related to men striving for social status and resource control. So men, to get married in traditional contexts and throughout much of history, they had to achieve some level of success. They had to get a well-paying job or be a good hunter or whatever it might be. So this agentic bias is related to status striving.
And interestingly, could this also explain why men are more likely to be scientists? Because scientists are interested in both the physical environment and mastering this environment. And men do have an inclination to master, as you cited in one of your pieces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the science thing is interesting. Scientists, particularly physical scientists, tend to be less people-oriented, more kind of abstract, thing-oriented, and math and science, math and spatial skills biased. And so you're more likely to get men with that profile than women, although women who go into these fields have a similar similar profile.
Disposition,
So
yes.
I think it is the, yeah. So I think that's part of it. When women go into science, they often go into biology, as I mentioned before, and there's a lot of very good biological and physical women scientists. They're just more men, especially in the physical sciences.
And David, this point is not overly studied by academics, but I do find it fascinating. What STEM subjects are quite difficult. However, men are less likely to drop out. When they fail, they seem to continue. Do we know why? Is there a specific scientific reason as to why men are not faced by failures in STEM?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so it's often called a kind of a leaky pipeline where women are dropping out at higher rates than men. I don't think playing out a variety of things, but I don't think that the mechanisms have been really fully objectively studied. I wonder if part of it is that once you get into computer science, for example, and you start taking courses on coding and doing other types of activities that maybe aren't that much fun, you're going to get more women less interested in these types of activities than men. As I said, men are kind of drawn to those sorts of less social fields on average. It's also the case that women have greater interest than men. So you think, okay, well, I'm going to try engineering, and it's takes a lot of time and effort, and on top of that, it's not that interesting. But I'm also interested in these other things, so I'm going to try out something else. Men are more likely to have narrow interests. So if they're focused on engineering, computer science, or whatever, they probably haven't given much thought to other areas because they're not that interested in it. And their reading, language, writing skills, and so forth tend to be lower than those of women. And so going into a heavy writing-based humanities program would also be difficult for them, but maybe less difficult for a lot of women.
And it could also be attributable to the confidence gap. Many studies have demonstrated that on average, men are likely to overrate their abilities.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So I think that, that's true. Men are, and boys are more likely to overestimate their abilities, even when they have a few failures to them. In women, at least in some studies, are more attuned to how they're doing in area A or area B. And so there it is, men's overconfidence and boys' overconfidence is a protective factor that helps them, get through, and many of them push through these difficult areas where they may initially experience some failures, but think, well, I can get it done anyway. With the fault was in A and B or whatever. That doesn't have anything to do with my inherent ability to do this. And that I think is contributing. I suspect that has to do with more an evolutionary history of more intense competition among males and females in our ancestors, and where if you give up the first time you fail at something, you're never going to achieve the status necessary to get married if you're a guy.
You're right. So for example, we do know according to studies that women prefer masculine men and masculine men are confident. So maybe men overrate their abilities in order to impress women.
Yeah, to impress women is important, and some, especially in contexts where men and women make their own marriage choices. In a lot of cultures, parents pick the spouse for you. But in order to be picked as a spouse by a woman or her family, you have to have achieved some type of success in your culture, whatever that might be.
And as you argue in your paper for Quillette, titled "The Real Causes of Human Sex Differences," men are more likely to fight as children, and this is across cultures and even in the animal kingdom. So from an early age, due to biological and cultural reasons, boys engage in roughhousing, and roughhousing is actually rewarded in the corporate world. To get ahead, one must project confidence, intelligence, and stamina. So for example, some years ago, a study was published saying that boys who do not do as well as girls in school, as adults, their professions are similar to girls who got straight A's. And I was not surprised because the real world rewards risk takers and aggressive people who demand change, not conformity.
Right.
And before you go, I have another point.
Sure.
This is one reason why feminists and their allies are baffled. Women today are doing better than men. According to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, most employees in America are women. But though women are becoming more educated and their wages are rising, at the top of the socioeconomic strata, the men are still dominant, and people are baffled. But you are not baffled, and I am not baffled, because the data and studies do suggest that the real world prefers a certain type of personality.
Right. So, yeah, there's more men at the top of the socioeconomic ladder, and there's also more men at the bottom of the ladder. So there's greater variability among men. So doing well in school is important for getting basic, reading, writing, math skills, and so forth. But in the real world, particularly in very competitive occupations, it takes more than having good grades in school. You have to be competitive. You have to work a lot of hours. You have to work more hours oftentimes than your competitors. You have to take risks. And sometimes those risks fail and you don't move up the ladder. But sometimes those risks pay off. And when they pay off, you do move up the ladder. So the skills that lead to good school performance are important but not enough to really move up the ladder. The competitiveness, the long hours, the working hard, the taking risks, and so forth is what it takes. And you see more men than women willing to make those trade-offs and take those risks.
And then the reward for competition based on sex differs. So for example, when men compete, there's usually a greater goal. They either end up with more money, a better job, status, or women. And women often compete to silence each other. So the motivation for competition based on sex are also different. And these have implications for real world development.
Right. So the men's competition is more agentic, focused on achieving a particular goal, increasing sales, generating more hours if you're billable hours, if you're a lawyer, getting that next promotion, whatever it might be. It's focused on a status related goal. Some women are like that as well, but many women, when they get in competitive situations, are focused on individual relationships. It's competition within a communal network rather than keeping your eye on the ball, so to speak, on the next goal and whatever it's going to do to kind of move you up.
And furthermore, women have the ability to give birth. Therefore, they cannot afford to take the silly risk that men sometimes do take.
Right. So if we, to really understand this, we have to go back to more natural conditions, what we see in traditional cultures, what population studies are now showing us, is that we have fewer male than female ancestors, and that is associated with more intense competition among males than females, often associated with high male mortality rates and polygyny. So in these contexts, successful males will have several wives, 3 or 4, or however many, and a lot of kids. Unsuccessful males will be dead or never reproduce. And so the payoffs to competition are high, and the costs of not competing are extremely high. And if you look at women, there's much less variation in how many kids women have, although there is still some variation. And so the payoffs to intense competition are not as high and are often costly. You can't really intensely compete and be pregnant and have small kids around to take care of. It just doesn't work.
And then again, we must also remember that in most societies, women are responsible for socializing children. The
Mhm.
functions of men and women are biologically and environmentally determined. So, for example, in Aeon magazine, one academic wrote an article noting that after becoming parents, the brains of people do change. Women are nurtured, and and men are forced to become more strategic.
Mhm. Yeah, so you do see shifts even in kind of modern cultures where once women have kids, many of them will cut back a bit on work, which of course will stall their career and lead to fewer higher status women and focus more on taking care of the kids and the family and so forth. Women cutting back means less money to the family, and so often the dad is working more hours or thinking more about how to how to make more money. So there are those dynamics there. I think one important thing that often isn't mentioned is that if you look at the life satisfaction of men and women in those contexts, there's no real difference, or women may even be more satisfied. So even though women are cutting back on their career to focus on kids, most of them are happy with that, even though men have to work harder in their careers to achieve more. Most are fine with that as well, because that's what they want to do anyway. They want to achieve more.
I think that this is the right time to comment on the Lubinsky study.
Sure.
Yes, and you may go ahead since you're the expert.
Okay, so yeah, this is a long-term longitudinal study done by David Lubinsky and Camilla Benbow. They identified thousands of academically gifted kids, especially mathematically gifted kids, when they were like 13 or so years of age. And they've been following these kids. Many of them are now in their 50s or older. And so they have, 40 years of data or so on them, and they know a lot about their occupation, what they did in college, what they did in graduate school, their occupations, how successful they have been, and so forth, all the way through middle age. And they know about sex differences. And so, focusing on sex differences, what we find is that many of individuals, men or women, who are interested in kind of a science career are pretty similar to one another in their 20s. When they hit the early 30s or so, many of the women begin to cut back because they are starting to have families, and they're focusing more on their families and friends than um, than the men are. Men in this studies are also more ambitious. They want to achieve more. They want to become famous or make a lot of money, whatever it is. They work more hours, and they're willing to work more hours. They're willing to trade off relationships with friends and personal hobbies and so forth to achieve more. And in women who are equally gifted mathematically and academically generally, um, have a more balanced view of life. Yeah, they want to do the research or work in the corporate world or whatever it is, but they don't want to do it 60 hours a week. They want to have time for family and friends and personal sorts of interests.
Exactly, and I do believe that it's also pertinent for me to read a snippet from your article. You refer to Catherine Akim. Akim concluded that patriarchal values have very little impact, and childcare responsibilities have no impact at all on work rates among work-centered women. In other words, women are not motivated or demotivated to work because of the perceived patriarchy. And furthermore, as she notes, men are also more work focused than women.
Right. Yeah. So this is a large scale, nationally representative study of thousands of people. I think that particular study is from the UK, but I believe it's also been done in the US. And here, in this particular analysis, they looked at, I think, adolescents and young adults' preferences for, in this case, women, whether they wanted to focus on work, a career, whether they wanted to be, quote, stay-at-home moms, be home focused, or whether they wanted a balance of work and home activities. And so what she found was 14% of women were work focused, 16% were home focused, and the vast majority of women kind of wanted some mix of, some outside work, but also enough time for family sorts of things. And the quote you just gave us was referring to the work focused women, that when they hit their 30s or so, more than 4 out of 5 of them have been completely able to focus on their career. And so they've done what they wanted to do. If anything, the women who are least able to realize their preferences are the home-focused women, because many of them actually have to take jobs to help support the family, to add as an adjunct to their husband's income.
Studies also do show that when women are in their 20s and 30s, they're able to narrow the gender gap. And Reach Advisor some years ago did a study contending that on average, younger women actually earn more than young men. The gender pay gap actually expands during the middle years. So for example, women who have children before 25 and after 35 are able to narrow the gap.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I think that's especially true in urban areas. And that's related in part to there are more women graduating from college now, at least in a lot of wealthy countries, than men are. And the ratio varies, but it's a significantly greater number of women than men. If you have a college degree, you're likely to earn more money than if you don't have a college degree, especially early on. And so that's where the gap has closed, and in some contexts even reversed, where women are making more on average than men in some urban contexts, at least in their 20s.
But David, we have established that men have a greater inclination for social status. Therefore, if men are driven by status, then they will be motivated to earn more money. This is not surprising.
Right. Yeah, they will be motivated to earn more money, but the status differences take a while to establish themselves. So you take a group of 20-year-old guys, and they all want to be rich or famous or whatever it is that's important to them, but you don't know who it is that's going to make it. And so the status climbing, sometimes decades. If you want to become a CEO of a big company, it's probably going to take you 30 years of work to do that. And so the status differentials and the gaps take time to emerge, and really probably not going to start to pull apart until late 20s, 30s or so.
Usually the status gaps become evident by the mid-30s.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, by the mid-30s, at that point, the people who are really serious. After graduating at 22, it may take you a time to get a job. At 25, you may get a job that you don't like. But at 30, you're more settled.
Right. So you have to find your niche. That takes a while, and then there's a lot of initial competition, and nobody quite knows who's the best person to hire or promote or whatever for younger folks. But yeah, as you said, once you hit 30, mid-30s or so, you begin to get more differentiation. And that's also a time when women who are going to have children start to have children and start to switch their focus. And there you're going to begin to see a widening of the gap, the sex differences gap.
Exactly. David, you also write on cognitive sex differences, and in one of your articles you contend that men have greater spatial abilities, and you gave the reason as to why this is the case. This article is titled Now you see them and now you don't. An evolutionary informed model of environmental influences on human sex differences. Tell us, why do men have greater spatial abilities?
Okay, couple things in that article, but first thing, why do men have better spatial abilities? It's well established that men have better spatial abilities in most spatial areas. There's different types of spatial abilities, and they have better mechanical reasoning abilities as well. As I said before, I think the mechanical reasoning part of it goes to tool construction. That is a deeper history in males and females in our species. Spatial abilities are often at least related in part to navigation. So how far you range from home. And so if we look at activities in traditional societies, men have larger ranges, maybe 2 to 4 times larger than women, due to hunting or intergroup competition, warfare, so forth. They travel farther than men, so farther than women. That's one contributing factor. Hunting involves a certain type of spatial ability where you have to identify objects that are embedded in other objects. Men do better on that type of
Repeat
disambiguation,
what you said, men.
tracking of
David,
projectiles.
David, you broke up for a minute, but before this
Okay.
ambiguation, what did you say?
Yeah, so if you're hunting, for example, you have to identify, a prey item that's hiding in bush, and so you have to disambiguate that animal from all the background stuff, which is a type of spatial ability that men do better on. With male-male competition, a lot of use of projectile weapons. So throwing rocks, arrows, spears, whatever it is, that is, you have to be able to kind of anticipate where something's going to hit based on the arc and its movement trajectory in space, which is a spatial ability that men are better at. And you also have to predict when something might hit you so you can dodge it, which is another spatial ability. So there are a variety of things that can influence and enhance visual spatial abilities. And men engage in more of those activities in traditional cultures than women do. But for the sex difference to be realized, boys have to engage in exploratory behavior and spatial related behaviors. Otherwise, they don't really fully develop these skills.
For David, you also know that women are more adept at identifying non-verbal communication cues. Why is this so?
Yeah, so when we look at cognition, men are better at some things and women are better at other things. Women are generally better at processing social related information. So identifying the emotions signaled by facial expressions, interpreting body language, changes in vocal intonation, and so forth. And I argue in my book that that's probably related to a couple of different things. One of those is developing a cooperative social network with 1 or 2 other women. That is going to be an important source of social support and help, especially when she has kids. But even before that, it's an important source of social support. And so you have to really read subtleties in relationships to develop and maintain those. Also, when women are competitive with one another, it typically involves a type of what's called relational regression, where it is much more subtle. Involve dissing or making fun of the other woman in a way that is deniable. So subtle eye rolling, flipping the hair, saying something that can be interpreted in 2 different ways, one of which is very negative, so forth, spreading rumors and all of that. So the competition among women is more relational, breaking up their social relationships, undermining their social support networks and their social support system, and it's done in a very subtle social way. And so I think women are better at the social cues because it helps them develop relationships that kind of buffer them from this type of aggression. And it also helps them detect relational aggression in other women. It also helps them use relational aggression to undermine competitors.
And women compete aggressively with each other. On average, men are more competitive, but when you put women in the ring, they are awful.
They can be, and it is a universal thing. When men are competing, it's pretty obvious. It often escalates to physical fighting, yelling, pushing, and so forth. So it's clear that it's happening. Women will sometimes escalate the physical aggression, but it's typically not as serious. It doesn't result in as serious an injury as we see in men. But they do engage in a lot of relational aggression, the subtle undermining, dissing, making fun of, spreading rumors about other women. And the descriptions of that in traditional societies are very consistent. The aggression of women is mostly directed toward other women, often directed toward co-wives. So successful men would typically be married to several women, and they're fighting with each other, or fighting with the mother-in-law or whatever. So there's a lot of dynamics there.
Yes, and I've read studies arguing that after competing, men are more likely to bond in contrast to women.
Yeah, that's right. One good slap fight, and the women may never talk to one another again, ever. So that's it, it's over. But the men will. They can escalate. It can be physical fight and injuries, but if they're friends or somebody that they may need in the future, they're more likely to make up and rebond. And that's probably because of the dynamics of male-male competition in traditional contexts and throughout human history, where you have men competing with one another within their group for status. And so there's competition and could be aggression within their group, but that group is also competing against other groups. And so you can't kill off your other group members during your rise to the top, because then your group is too small to be competitive. So you have to maintain the cohesion of the in-group in order to be successful against other male groups. And so I think that's where that comes from.
So far, we have been exploring gender differences and also sex differences in cognition. The greater male variability hypothesis is popular, but I'm guessing that some of our viewers may not know why, on average, men are also more likely to be extremely brilliant and also quite dumb. Why is this so?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here you're dumb, you're in brilliant. So you're looking at general cognitive ability or fluid intelligence. And on average, men and women are pretty similar on that on average. But if we look at the distribution of scores, it's more spread out for men than for women. And so you see more males at the low end, and you also see more males at the high end. There are a number of biological mechanisms that are proposed to underlie that would affect brain development and so forth that might influence these sorts of outcomes. There's no consensus on exactly what is driving it yet, but greater variability of males than females on a lot of traits is common, including general cognitive ability, get a lot of brilliant guys. You get some brilliant women, but typically more guys. Then you get more dumber guys than dumber women.
David, do we know why men are more inventive?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of it is related to the competition side of it. So males are are focused on doing better than other males, whatever that better is. And if you're an engineer or scientist or whatever, it's discovering new things, inventing new things. If you're a painter, it is, like Picasso, developing cubism or something new that makes them stand out against, in this case, competitors. So I think the motivations are there to achieve and to do something different. And so longer hours, greater investment in it. And in some areas like engineering, if you look at patents and so forth, males have advantages in mechanical reasoning, which may contribute to that as well.
Furthermore, the innovative capacity of men could be ascribed to individualism. On average, men are more individualistic and less likely to conform.
Right. Yeah. So that gets back to that communal agentic component before. The communal thing is you want everybody happy, and so you're more agreeable and cooperative and so forth. But for men, even in many traditional contexts, they have to establish themselves on their own as a good hunter, a good provider, or good, have a good occupation, whatever that might be. They have to establish it on their own to establish some type of status relative to other men, and also to make themselves attractive to women. And one way to do that is to, focus on your own stuff and be non-conforming, at least in some contexts.
Similarly, according to a 2019 PNAS study, men are also higher on measures of rationality, whereas women tend to empathize. Therefore, innovators, because they're rational and individualistic, they're less likely to care about how people feel. Right. So this could motivate them to invent.
Right. So greater focus on outcomes, and that particular study was focused on things, how gadgets work and so forth, in men's interest in that. And so if you're focused on, inventing something or coming up with a new idea and so forth, and often new ideas upset people because they're different than what they were before, than what people expect or want to hear. Focused on that, if you're worried about what other people think or feel, then even if you come up with a new idea, you won't publish it or express it or whatever. And so those that are successful with generating new things can't be as concerned about the social consequences.
And another puzzle is the greater productivity of male researchers and scientists in contrast to women. What are some of the findings, David?
Yeah, so in most fields, most academic fields, sciences, and even outside sciences, men publish more than women. And there are more men at the kind of most influential group of, say, the top 10% or wherever you want to make the cut, than women. Now, there are some women who are and there are women in this time. There's just more men. There's also more men who do nothing as well. So you get the greater variability there. I think that's related, at least in part, to the choices that men and women make in terms of trade-offs between focusing on status-related things, publishing in this case, and spending time with family, friends, and just taking care of yourself. So part of it is just investment. Part of it, I think, is also there's more men at the high end of ability that is going to be important in these areas.
And likewise, according to the Lubinsky study, the women valued community and personal relationships, whereas the men emphasized financial status. So again, men have a greater preference for status and social accolades. Therefore, they will be motivated to produce at a higher level because their values are distinct from those of women.
Right, right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And this is an important study because in this study, all of the men and all of the women are brilliant. And the brilliant men are focusing more and more on achievement and money or whatever it is that's important to them, that signal status. And the women are doing that to some extent, but not the same extent as men. And they're taking more time for personal, family, relationship sorts of things.
So, for example, David, let me reference popular culture. Recently, I watched a movie, and the movie was starred by famous actresses. I don't remember their names, but the gist of the movie is this: two women are friends, and the boss is quite aggressive. She's more like a man in terms of her personality, and because she's aggressive and fixated on money and competition, the friendship of the two women is adversely affected. So in the long term, they decide to compete against the woman, against their boss who's more aggressive, and eventually they won. But based on my reading of the movie, I find that the boss was actually a realistic CEO. As a CEO, she's interested in money, not sentiment. And the women were more sentimental and fixated on activism, whereas the boss was your stereotypically masculine male-like CEO.
Mm-hmm. Well, right. I mean, if you're a CEO, whether you're a man or a woman, you're expected to do and to do that, you have to take an agentic stance on things and not a communal kind of relationship stance on it. You know, and there are women, as Hakem in this study we talked about previously, 14% of women, have those types of interests. It's just, there's more men that have.
Yeah, exactly. I was actually looking for the name of the movie, but when I'm able to recall, I will tell you the name. It's not important at the moment.
Okay, yeah,
David,
I didn't see it.
David, you also write quite a bit on gender differences in political engagement. Are men more engaged in politics, and if so, why?
Yeah, that's a pretty consistent finding, even in societies where women vote and been voting for a long time, can run for office. In the U.S., I think women who run for office are, just as likely to be elected as men are. So there's no difference there. But there are many more men in Congress, the Senate, and in other countries in parliaments than there are women. And so there's that gap there that often generates a lot of discussion and angst among some people. But I think the status in competition. If you become a successful politician, you have a lot of status. You probably have a lot of social influence. You're going to get a lot of resources and money and so forth. I mean, that's the ultimate status position. And it's just more attractive to men than women. So I think they're more likely to go into politics and stay in than women are.
David, the name of the movie is Like a Boss.
Like a Boss. Haven't
Yes,
seen.
yeah, it's a 2020 film. But back to our conversation re political engagement. A
Mm-hmm.
study was published in 2021 by a German writer submitting that the difference is not on the axis of liberalism versus conservatism, but freedom versus security. Men are agentic, they tend to be a bit more autonomous, women prefer security. And as such, the political opinions of men differ, and men are also likely to hold extreme political positions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you do see, in addition to the numbers of men and women who kind of take hardcore politics as a career, you see differences in political preferences. So women are more likely to favor policies that increase security social security, so safety net sort of things, preschool for all, welfare for kids without dads, and those sorts of things. Men are more focused on the potential external threats to the country or nation or whatever it is. And so they're more focused on things like military spending and national competitiveness.
Like myself, I care more about national competitiveness than gender quotas, especially in light of the fact that gender quotas do not predict firm profitability.
Right, and we wouldn't expect it to. We might expect that it might actually reduce profitability.
Well, it did reduce profitability in Norway because on average, women in Norway were younger and had less experience. So in that context, gender quota reduced firm profitability.
Right. Okay. That makes sense, because now you're selecting board members based on something other than expertise in that area.
David, so you wrote an article titled "The World Economic Forum and the Misleading Politics of Gender Equality." What are your objections to the Global Gender Gap Index? After all, hold on. After all, in America, the average recipient of a PhD is a woman, but people seem to assume that women are struggling.
Yeah, well, because there is a heavy media, academic, and so forth bias to present women as struggling, which then bolsters arguments to give women more preferences. I think it's just a social political manipulation. The World Economic Forum puts out the Gender Global Gap Index once a year, and they look at how well women are doing relative to men in 4 areas of life: healthy lifespan, educational opportunities, things like representation in politics and parliament and so forth, and on economic measures such as income. And every year, women, the gap is lower than you would get with equality. So women are disfavored on this gap every single year. And the issue, at least in wealthy, highly developed countries, is primarily in terms of economic indicators and political representation indicators. If we look at something like education, which, as you mentioned, women are now better educated than men. Although with this gap, once women are better educated than men, they count that as equality, not as a disadvantage for men. So the gap is biased in that way for the educational stuff and also for the health lifespan stuff. But in any case, women are always behind because they're earning less on average, and you have fewer women in parliament or the Senate or whatever, depending on what country you're in. So there's always a huge, press releases and so forth saying, women are disadvantaged in all of these areas. The problem with the gap is they don't take into consideration sex differences and preference. Men are more focused on status, income,
David,
indicators.
David, repeat yourself for a minute. After you said sex differences in preferences, you broke up a bit. So just continue from there.
Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. So the GGGI doesn't take into account sex differences and preferences in the economic domain or the political domain. As we have discussed already, more men than women, work longer hours, or more career focused, or more status focused, more likely to go into politics, and so forth. And so there's going to be, more higher paid men. There are going to be more men in politics, and the GGI then kind of puts this as a gap. where women are somehow disadvantaged here. But they're assuming that just as many women as men want to work 60 hours a week to earn high incomes and want to go into politics and deal with all the dynamics that go on there. And my argument is that men and women do not have equal preferences in these areas. Men are more engaged economically and politically and invest more time in it at a cost to their own personal health, oftentimes in a cost to family and friends. And so the index is set up in a way that will always look like women are disadvantaged, when in fact, if we look at women's life satisfaction and men's life satisfaction in these same countries, women are often more satisfied than men. So there aren't as many women in politics, they're not earning as much, but they have the time and safety to invest in family, friends, relationships, and so forth. And so they're happier.
You're right, David. I know professional women who are spectacularly bright, but one told me that as a young woman, she refused to enter into a particular profession because she had a boyfriend and she wanted to enjoy herself, and she does not have regrets.
Right, right. I think countries should be providing opportunities for people to reach their potential and make important life choices for themselves. And under those conditions, men and women are choosing different things. And those personal choices are associated with general happiness for both women and men. And often women have higher life satisfaction than men in these contexts. But those choices also result in differences in economic outcomes and in political representation, that then the World Economic Forum then says that, well, see, women are being held back, being biased, there's bias holding them back and so forth. And they don't really consider.
Yeah, they do not consider personality differences. Yes. So for example, David.
Or yes.
Yes, you're breaking up a bit. So for example, I work and I have a channel and I write, run a business, run a YouTube channel. Anything that's worth doing is often expensive and taxing. But I often tell people that I prefer to work than to socialize. Sorry, but I'm not big on friends. I prefer to work and read long articles and write them than to socialize and talk to people. So I work, I do my YouTube channel and I write articles. And personally, I'm not even interested in the notion of happiness.
Yeah, well, I'm pretty much the same. And that work ethic and focus and stuff will, for most of the time, pay off in the long run. It takes time, but eventually it will pay off. And if you're very sociable, you like hanging out with people and so forth, that's fine. You can go ahead and do that.
There's nothing wrong with socialization, but I prefer the quality of the socialization. So I often tell people, I am not interested in social media. I don't care about the followers. I prefer to be followed by 10 influential people than by 1 million idiots.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I care about the quality of the people who follow me and very influenced than a random person. A random person with no influence or power means nothing to me. So on that level, I socialize, but other than that, I like to work.
Right.
So David, we had an excellent conversation, but unfortunately, the internet was a problem.
Okay. Yes. Will you be able to edit some of that?
I'll try, but the channel was started in March. I'm still in the testing phase.
Okay.
So I have someone who's more competent at editing, so I'll see what he can do. But fortunately for me, whenever something like this occurs, people don't comment on it, and I wonder why. They still like it.
Yeah, well,
people like the content, David. People like the content.
Yeah. And it's probably happened to them numerous times
Yes.
as well. So they understand the glitches. So I don't think it'll be a problem. I
Yeah.
think,
People like the content. So I started the show in March because before March I was never a big fan of YouTube, but I recognized that YouTubers were interviewing the same people consistently, and they were
Mhm.
not delving into serious issues. So I said, I'm not going to complain. I'm going to start a channel. And
Okay.
so far, the academics like yourself, they have been coming on. I had Richard Nisbet and Robin Dunbar, you,
Mhm.
and I have people from the left, the right, the far right. They're all coming on.
Yeah, I saw that. I looked up your channel before
Yeah,
we talked. Very impressive group of folks.
yeah, from everywhere. And if you
Yeah.
listen to these conversations, even with people on the far right, they're very academic. I don't engage in mudslinging.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no mudslinging. So
That's
Kevin McDonald was on the program, and we talk about Western history and the family. We didn't mention Jews or anything like that. We mentioned Jews in the last 1 minute and moved on and then ended the show. I'm not interested in mudslinging or politics.
okay. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah,
Me either.
yeah. But it was a pleasure to have you on, David. Bye. And we'll talk again. I may send you a Zoom link and we can have a personal conversation. All right.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Great
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye bye.